Good afternoon, classmates. We are the Group 2 and we will be talking about exposure and vulnerability. First, what is exposure? Exposure refers to the location, attribute, and value of assets that could be affected by a hazard, which means it is the area that is exposed and could be prone to the dangers of the calamity. While vulnerability refers to the likelihood the assets will be damaged, destroyed, or affected when exposed to a hazard. It means that vulnerability is a chance or that an area will be affected or damaged. What are the various elements that may be exposed to hazards? First, environmental hazard. We can categorize environmental hazard as physical, chemical, biological, and cultural. Physical hazard refers to the natural occurring events such as storms and earthquakes. Chemical hazards are chemical-related hazards like lead and mercury that are both toxic chemicals. Biological hazards are hazards that come from interaction of organisms. Viruses and infection are both examples of this. Cultural hazards are most man-made hazards like pollution and crimes. The next is social hazards. Social hazards are just like cultural hazards that are mostly man-made hazards like pollution and crimes. And last, economic hazards are hazards that impact our economy. Exchange rate fluctuation and political instability are examples of this. Now, let's have Razel report the next topic.
Thank you, Marco, and good afternoon, everyone. So, for the next lesson, elements at risk and exposure. Now, before I start with the discussion, I want you to guess what the elements refers to. I'll give you 5 seconds. Okay, so if you guess people, properties, economic activities, and public and private services, you are correct. Because these elements can experience risk and exposure to a harmful event. So now that we know what these elements are, let us proceed to the next slide. Elements at risk and exposure. Risk assessment involves the identification and mapping of the elements at risk and the assessment of vulnerability. Now, in other words, risk assessment is the term used to describe an overall process or method. So what are this overall process and method that is used in or that is conducted in risk assessment? So we have a hazard identification, which identify hazard and risk factors that can cause them. Dito sinasagawa yung pag-identify ng hazard, tapos tinutukoy rin nila kung ano yung risk factors na pwedeng maging dahilan nung pagkakaroon ng harmful event dun sa elements. And now, the second one is risk analysis and risk evaluation. From the word itself, risk analysis and risk evaluation, this is where they analyze and evaluate the risk associated with that hazard. So, hinahanap nila dito yung risk and nag-evaluate din sila na kung ano yung pwedeng maging risk nga ng mga elements na konektado dun sa na-identify nilang hazard, which is dun sa nakandak nilang hazard identification. So tandaan nyo lang that in risk assessment, it involves hazard identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. In the second sentence, in order to reduce risk, much of the focus is on reducing vulnerability. The question is, how can we reduce vulnerability? So the third sentence is actually the answer to it. Understanding the elements at risk and exposed to each type of hazard is the first step in reducing vulnerability. So bakit natin kailangan i-reduce yung pagiging vulnerable ng isang element sa isang hazard or exposure? Para ma-reduce natin yung risk niya. And para ma-reduce natin yung vulnerability nga is dapat ma-identify natin or maintindihan natin yung mga risk or yung risk ng elements sa isang hazard or sa iba't ibang hazard. Now, for the next slide, I've been saying the word hazard a lot kasi feeling ko naman meron kayong knowledge about it. But if you don't have, this is the meaning of hazard. Hazard is a natural process or phenomenon that may pose negative impacts on the economy, society, and ecology, including both natural factors and human factors that are associated with the natural ones. So meaning, a hazard is a natural process or phenomenon na meron siyang effect dun sa elements, which is a negative effect dun sa elements. Next is the risk model. So in the risk model, the formula is risk is equals to hazard times exposure times vulnerability. Now, if bibigyan natin siya ng situation para mas maintindihan natin yung risk model, makikita natin siya dito sa first picture. So in the first picture, ang hazard is occurrence of a landslide at a particular location. Meaning the hazard here is the landslide. Next, exposure, people and or buildings in a place that could be affected by a landslide. So, sa exposure, it just simply tells kung sino ang exposed dun sa landslide na yon. And then, sa vulnerability naman, the likelihood that people and or property are affected by a landslide. So, sa vulnerability, these are the, ito yung may mga chances talaga na pwedeng maapektuhan ng landslide or ng hazard na yun. And pag kinombine mo itong tatlo, it will result to risk. It will result to risk. And for the last picture, how can we reduce risk? So as I've said earlier, in order to reduce risk, we must focus on reducing the vulnerability. Now, this is naka-apply naman sa risk model. So, in the risk model, syempre may hazard, may exposure, and may vulnerability. Now, dun sa hazard, we can improve our abilities to monitor and forecast hazards. So, tama naman, dapat mag-improve pa yung pag-monitor natin sa isang hazard or pag-forecast nito. So, malinaw na tayo kung paano natin ma-reduce yung risk under hazard. Next is exposure. Sa exposure, it says that para ma-reduce natin yung risk and exposure, we should increase awareness of the hazards faced by communities and their exposure to them. So, this is very self-explanatory, which kailangan lang natin gawin is maging aware sa mga hazards na pwede natin ma-experience, and kailangan natin syempre na malaman that we are exposed to this type of hazard. Sa vulnerability naman, lastly, is the greatest benefits can be achieved by reducing the vulnerability to natural hazards. So, sabi ko nga kanina, in order to reduce risk, we should focus on reducing the vulnerability. So, ma-reduce natin yung risk kapag nagtuon talaga tayo ng pansin or binigyan natin ng pansin yung pag-reduce natin sa vulnerability sa natural hazards na pwede nating ma-experience. I hope you understood what I've discussed and how we can reduce the risk, and also what are the elements at risk and exposure. That is the end of my report. I am going to give the mic to the next reporter, Ms. Regine Valenzuela.
We will discuss social, environmental, and economic dimensions of exposure and vulnerability. Social. The social dimensions of exposure and vulnerability covers a wide range of concerns, but demography is the most important aspect. For example, certain population groups may be more vulnerable than others. A rapidly aging population is more vulnerable as health, economic growth, and mobility issues are pronounced. Next is environmental. The physical aspects of exposure and vulnerability refer to location and built structures. For example, developing nations face more exposure and vulnerability to hazards because of their relative inability to adapt to changes and create wealth that may enhance resilience. We also have economic. Economic vulnerability is the susceptibility of individuals, communities, businesses, and governments to absorb or cushion the effects of hazard events. Here's the list of the physical elements exposed to various hazards. Under the essential facilities, we have educational facilities, medical healthcare facilities, emergency response facilities, government offices, recreational or tourist facilities, places of worship, banks and financial centers, markets and shopping centers, and cemeteries. Under the industrial and high potential loss facilities and facilities containing hazardous materials are dams and pools, fuel reservoir, pipelines and pumps, power generating plants and lines, multipurpose hydropower plants, water tanks and lines, food processing facilities. Here are some examples of transportation lifelines. We have highway, bridges, railway tracks and tunnels, bus facilities, port and harbor facilities, airport facilities and runways. And at the right side, we have the example of utility lifelines. We have portable water facilities, wastewater facilities, pipelines and distribution lines, oil and natural gas system facilities, pipelines and distribution lines, electric power facilities and distribution lines, communication facilities and distribution lines. The next slide will be discussed by Carl Schanbenlo.
Before we discuss the vulnerability of each exposed elements, let's first define vulnerability. According to the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, vulnerability is the degree of loss to a given element at risk at a certain severity level. Meaning, vulnerability is the effect or the estimated damage of a certain property or population that is exposed to possible risks. Now, for example, a building with multiple floors. Now, that building is vulnerable to shaking from an earthquake and more likely to collapse than a one-story building. Now, there is a formula in vulnerability. Vulnerability is equal to exposure plus resistance plus resilience. Now, since we know what vulnerability is, let's discuss the 4 factors of vulnerability, mainly social, environmental, economic, and physical. Social. Certain population groups may be more vulnerable than others, considering public awareness of risk, ability to self-cope with catastrophes, and status of institutional structures designed to help them cope. For example, children are more exposed to more hazards than any other age group. Why? Because children are uneducated. That's why there are institutions, schools, they are taught to protect themselves in times of danger. Now, Ms. Napoles will discuss the remaining factors of vulnerability.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm going to discuss environmental vulnerability. So when we say environmental vulnerability, these are the potential impacts on our environment, ecosystems, and biodiversity. The main key aspect in this vulnerability is the natural resources depletion and resources degradation. So, for example, when reduced biodiversity, it results to food supplies being more vulnerable to pests and diseases. Also, freshwater shortage or irregular supply. So this kind of situation is shown in the environmental vulnerability or can be observed in the environmental vulnerability. This is economic vulnerability. So, economic vulnerability is the susceptibility of an individual, community, governments, or businesses to absorb or cushion the effect of an hazard event. So, the highly vulnerable in this kind of situation are those dependent on the economic status. So, for an example, the most vulnerable or the highly vulnerable are those who don't have a stable job, and the less vulnerable are those who have a stable job. Why? Because they lack the resources to build a safer home for to protect themselves from a disaster. So, in this kind of an situation, we can see that those who don't have a stable job are more vulnerable than those who have a stable job. So that is an example of economic vulnerability. So lastly is the physical vulnerability. So physical vulnerability is the physical impact on the physical environment that can be expressed as an element at risk. So it is mostly influenced by the geographical pattern of the severity of hazards in the locality, number, density, spatial distribution, and spatial characters of population, groups, and effects of the locality conditions, of their local conditions. So, an example of this is a physical structure is vulnerable if its serviceability is likely to be damaged or disrupted by a hazardous event. Another is when a one-story building is less vulnerable than those that are five-story building. So in this kind of example, we can see that that it shows the physical structure is vulnerability because of its serviceability, and that can be concluded that it is physically vulnerable. Quantifying vulnerability. Quantifying tangible aspect of vulnerability is useful in estimating precisely how much mitigation and preparedness measures shall be applied. This means that quantifying vulnerability is used to know what are the preparedness or the actions that we still need to do, we still need to learn in order to reduce or to lessen the impact on the elements at risk. So, vulnerability can be expressed simply between the quantities 0 and 1, 0 being the lowest and 1 being the highest. So, vulnerability can be measured using different methods, and one of them is ratio. Ratio is used to measure the casualties for people, and for buildings, their per cost, it can be expressed as our per cost on the degree of the physical damage. And when we're dealing to a much larger area, the proportions of the damaged building is used as a method to measure the vulnerability. So that's all for our presentation today. I hope you learned something, and thank you for listening. And as we end this presentation, we want you to know that we also prepared a simple activity that you need to answer with regards with our presentation. So thank you again, and I hope you did learn something from our presentation. That's all. Thank you.